Welcome, everybody. Good morning, and thank you so much for coming to the Aspen Institute's No Child Left Behind Commission hearings on effective teachers and effective principals. We are delighted to have everyone here. I want to do a quick introduction of the commissioners and then say a couple of words about today's hearings before we start with our first honored guest, Lieutenant Governor Barbara O'Brien. Delighted to have an outstanding group of commissioners here to join us. I want to introduce, starting from my right side here, the far right, we have Dr. Jane Hanaway, who is the Director of the Education Policy Center and the Urban Institute for National Center for Analysis of Longitudinal Data and Education Research, or CALDR. Also delighted to have on my right Ms. Tasia Providence, who is a master educator from the District of Columbia Public Schools. Delighted to have her join us. Then starting from my far left, we have also Ms. Danica LaCroix, who is the principal of the Young Scholars Academy for Discovery and Exploration in Brooklyn, and Dr. Michael Ortiz, who's the president of the California State Polytechnic University in Pomona, and immediately to my left, Mr. Gary Huggins, who is the executive director of the Aspen Institute's NCLB Commission. So I want to thank them all for coming to Denver. We're certainly honored to have you here. We also have two outstanding panels this morning. The first one will be led by the Lieutenant Governor, so we get a chance to ask her some questions directly. Then after that, I'll introduce our panel of experts who will be joining us after that. Quick introduction to this morning's work. As people know, don't need to convince this crowd that this is a critical moment right now in American education. We know that right now in this country, there continue to be vast disparities between kids' achievement levels based on their income and based on the neighborhoods they grow up in, based on sometimes how fat their parents' wallets are, the zip code that they're born in. And we now have a more and more urgent challenge to try and find ways to remedy that problem. When we know that fewer than 9% of low-income kids in this country will ever finish college, we know that we've yet to deliver on that great American promise that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all are created equal. And so we are here in part today to think about what the opportunities are to accelerate improvement in education reform. As you know, this started in 2002 with the passage of No Child Left Behind, which for those who loved it and those who hated it, certainly changed the game in education reform. I think it pushed in a way that never had before a real focus on standards, a real focus on assessments, and a real focus on accountability. And so now as the Congress prepares to reauthorize No Child Left Behind, it's an especially important opportunity for us to look back at what has worked and what hasn't worked over the last 7 years and begin to make some thoughtful recommendations about the ways that we might go forward. The Aspen Institute's commission itself was founded in 2006 to do just that and convened a group of commissioners and experts from around the country to take public hearing and testimony and then make some recommendations about where they thought then the country ought to go. I was not a part of the original commission. We have a number of new commissioners, which I'm delighted to join. But the first round of feedback came out in 2007. The Aspen Institute published a paper called Beyond NCLB, which was tremendously influential on reshaping the conversation about the purpose of NCLB, and particularly on this question we're here to talk about today, which is teacher effectiveness and principal effectiveness. As we all know, as a former principal and teacher myself, we spent the last 7 years in the world of highly qualified teachers, which is we all had to figure out if we were qualified, if not, how we got highly qualified or how we got our teachers highly qualified. And so the NCLB Commission was very instrumental in part in redirecting our focus from one on qualifications to one on effectiveness. Not what are the inputs that educators bring into the profession, but what are the actual outputs they generate once that they're in the profession. And so I think that has been a really high impact change in terms of the way that we think about and support teachers and principals. So that brings us to today's hearing, and we are honored to host it in Denver. The NCLB Commission looks at places around the country to hold hearings that they think are doing particularly exciting and innovative work. So it's an honor to our state and to our city and to the leadership of folks like Lieutenant Governor and Superintendent Boasberg that they selected our state and city as a location. And today is really going to be a chance for us to dig deeply into this question of what makes an effective teacher and what makes an effective principal, and how do we begin to get down to the work of recruiting, retaining, rewarding, and in some cases non-renewing principals and teachers based on their demonstrated effectiveness. And so we're excited to hear from a number of stakeholders today about what they think the real opportunities are there, what the risks are, and how we might begin to move this forward. So I'm going to shorten my opening comments in order to get right to the panelists that we have before us to get to hear from them. I would just add that we know that effective teaching is the single most significant variable that impacts student achievement in the classroom, and that effective school leadership is the second most important variable. So we know today if we could just solve the teacher and principal problem, we would solve more than 60% of the total impact on student achievement within a classroom. And so when people say, is there a silver bullet in education? Yes, there is. The silver bullet is, how do we get a lot more highly effective teachers and principals into classrooms? If we can do that, we can transform student achievement in a way that other reform attempts like class size and others only begin to approximate the impact of those two criteria. So couldn't be a more important topic and couldn't be a better group of folks to hear from. So without any further ado, I will introduce my great friend and Lieutenant Governor Barbara O'Brien. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you very much. Welcome to Colorado and our lovely state capital. And I hope when you head back to wherever your homes are, you will talk about that incredible snow we had in Denver, because that will help market our ski industry. And we need all of the economic development we can get right now. So thank you very much. It's a real honor to be with you today. I think the mood across Colorado and talking with my colleagues in other states is that we all have really been engaged in trying to reform and improve public education. Many of us have been creating college and career academic standards and assessments, cross-system longitudinal data systems, and trying to turn around chronically low-performing schools. These policies and efforts, I believe, have tried to enhance No Child Left Behind, but it's clear we do need a rewrite, and I do think a reconceptualization of it in some other form that's more modern and more attuned to what's really going on at the state and district level. So we are engaged in this, but I think we have come to the realization that this panel is focused on that the best crafted policies aren't going to make a difference about student performance if we don't have different ways of maximizing human capital. And by that I mean not only the educators in schools, but the students who are attending the schools. So we can set very rigorous standards, which we are in the process of doing, but frankly, they're going to be meaningless without great teachers and leaders who have the professional development to teach to new standards. We can identify achievement gaps, but they're not going to close without committed professionals that go above and beyond what they're used to doing in their careers. We can have the best intentions for turning around struggling schools, but they're not going to be turned around if we don't rethink how we structure the day, structure the year, and recruit the right match between teachers and students to get the kind of student performance that we're looking for. And in particular, in the chronically struggling schools, I do believe that we need to find a way to recruit teachers and principals who understand how to establish a culture of excellence in a school that's mostly known disappointment. And I can't think of very many schools of education or teacher prep programs around the country that have figured out how to focus on that and teach it. So I hope the reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act will be done in a way that will actually drive improvement in student performance and not tinker with the inputs that go into education. I think we're all here today because we know we must do better and we can't wait. And I urge you, by starting to think about ESEA as building partnerships between federal, state, and local levels. And from the state perspective, figuring out how to have a real dialogue and a flexible relationship that lets us all learn from both what's working well and from where we're struggling, rather than these rigid frameworks that it takes, 7, 8, 10 years to change. So in Colorado, since 2007, Governor Ritter and I have pursued a wide variety of educational reforms. And we've tried to think truly preschool through graduate school, P20. And we've been guided by a coherent strategy for moving the state forward. We wanted a student-centered system. We wanted educators to have the tools they need to be successful. And we want flexible, multiple pathways throughout the system. So ways for mid-career people to become teachers, and ways for teachers to advance in their careers in more ways than just out of the classroom and into administration. We've been looking for ways for students to move faster or slower through high school and talking about what does this mean for teaching? What does it mean for better technology and online, and how do we help educators get the skills they need to really personalize and individualize more instruction, especially for students who are already behind. And we've been looking for ways for students to simultaneously pursue multiple degrees and certificates. I heard an analogy once that it's the difference between the old tape cassette for a recorder where you begin at the beginning and you run through and you can sort of rewind a little bit, versus a CD with random access. You can drop in where you need to at any point or what you want to listen to. And I think that's trying to capture what we envision for a 21st century education system. So it is the people who create magic in an education system, but we also know it's people who crush curiosity and deaden imaginations. And we have to find a way to help teachers stay engaged throughout their whole careers, to give them opportunities to advance, and for students to take more ownership of their own educations. So how do we turn that into effective teaching that's reliable and predictable in a system? So we have streamlined alternative licensure policies for career changers. We created a state-level grant program to help school districts develop alternative compensation models. We aligned data systems so we could better understand and research the factors that affect student outcomes. We created a growth model for student performance that has now been adopted by 6 other states. We created innovation schools so that teachers in a school could vote to waive district and union rules to better meet the educational needs of their students. I now believe we have 5 schools where the faculty have voted to do that. And the impact of this and this policy framework is intended to shift the state's definition of teacher quality from one that focused on inputs like degree levels and licensure types to outputs like student performance. So we are hoping that as No Child Left Behind is rethought and rewritten, that flexibility, outcomes orientation, results that matter, but maximum flexibility at the state and local level is likely to produce the changes we want to see as a nation, and it'll help us learn what to then spread to more of our education sites. We've really tried to avoid imposing policies on anyone, so we have a rather massive stakeholder outreach program. And in the Race to the Top effort, we have more than 600 people who are involved in helping write the Race to the Top proposal. We had online access, so anyone in any rural area could participate online without having to drive to Denver. And we are in serious productive discussions with CEA, our largest teachers union, to modernize the state teacher evaluation program. So we are trying to walk the talk, and we're hoping that at the national level, you'll be able to have the same mix of flexibility options, but national priorities about where we ought to be headed, that as states we can work toward with you and side by side with the federal government. So thank you very much, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Lieutenant Governor. Do we have questions from members of the Commission for Lieutenant Governor?
Lieutenant Governor, one question, and having started my professional career as a teacher, I have a fondness for what teachers do, but in the career paths that we've seen in Colorado and in other places for teachers, it always appears that just being an outstanding teacher isn't enough to receive rewards for, that you have to go into becoming a mentor, you have to go into doing other things in order for you to be remunerated for the things that you do. So that, why is that the case? And in using your role and my role as an example, we have all-consuming jobs. For someone to say you have to do this extra in order to get additional pay doesn't really, to me, keep those people that are effective in the classroom in the classroom.
one thing we heard from teachers was that if we had an array of options where teachers could decide where they wanted to fit in for multiple career pathways. So for example, what if a teacher wanted to have a classroom that could be observed by people who want to come watch a master teacher, but doesn't want to leave the class to go coach others? What would it take for a teacher just to have their lesson plans available, their materials available, where they go to find new ideas, and just make the classroom open and inviting to people who want to watch a master teacher in action, all the way up to someone that is almost a circuit rider in the rural areas, going to some of our far-flung districts demonstrating how you teach fractions or something. So have lots of levels where teachers could self-select once they've been identified as being really good at what they do.
Thank you for your comments, Lieutenant Governor. Denver's been on the forefront of reform on teacher policy and teacher compensation policy. And if you think of it as an experimental setting right here in your state, I'm wondering what the lessons that the state has learned from the Denver experience, and are there ways in which the beneficial lessons can be spread across the state with state efforts?
I'll give a brief answer to that because the superintendent of Denver Public Schools is here, so he knows it in a lot more detail. But we found that Denver Public Schools had to change how it worked because it didn't work quite the way they wanted to at first. So flexibility, I might reinforce that notion. We also found that you absolutely have to have buy-in by the public, the taxpayers who are paying, the teachers who are affected by it, and the school system. And we now have a number of districts across Colorado that have created their own models for alternative compensation, and they're all slightly different, but they all took teacher buy-in to whatever the system was. So it's something you do together. It's not something you impose on people. And I would give you more details, but I would give away our race to the top ideas.
Okay, I'll give you a pass then. Thank you.
Lieutenant Governor, thank you so much for sharing what Colorado is doing. I have one question. How should teacher preparation coursework change to target teacher effectiveness? And do you think that people that want to become principals should take new or different types of coursework so that they are effective in the schools where they work? And what would that look like?
I met with 5 metro area superintendents just last week just to talk about the subject of teacher preparation, and it's very spotty. They do feel that some prep programs are doing a good job, and others, they really have to plan on some fairly serious induction activities. So it's not standardized at all. So somehow improving the standards for teacher preparation would work. They're asking for much more of the prep time being in the classroom, much more hands-on, and then backed up by coaching through the first year or two of a career instead of sort of putting them in and shutting the door and it's kind of over. They did feel that the younger teachers were much more open to finding additional resources as they went along, that their, the technology era has just helped reduce some of the isolation that can take place in sort of the old form of teaching. They felt there was a crisis around the development of principals, that there are very few coming along that know how to take on the tough schools. And they didn't seem to think there was a pattern between teachers arising through, the classroom or people coming in from the outside. It was that what you need to do to be an instructional leader in a school and how we recruit and train principals are not aligned at all. So they were very interested in finding better ways to do that at the leadership level.
You talk about faster and slower educational paths. Can you just tell us a little bit more about that and how it would drive federal policy? So
we have not pulled this off yet, so I don't want to claim that we have evidence. that it works. But what we're intending to do, and this is out of legislation that was passed 2 years ago, is come up with an assessment system to go with our new state standards, which are in line with the Common Core that people are talking about, and have much more of it be done online so that there's more student self-assessment. There's the ability of teachers to get very quick feedback on how their students are doing and figure out how to regroup or reteach almost on a day-to-day basis, depending on the feedback they get, rather than in our state, these long delays between standardized test results coming back. And we're hoping that we can add to sort of a traditional assessment system, is just more technology advanced, that we can start using simulations and things that you do in community college or in the military to test kids' skills, so that it's not just content-based, but it's can you do it based. And if we can do that to let students come closer to proceeding at their own pace rather than in the assembly line model. Now, how that will look, how we handle high school degrees, we haven't tackled that, but we think that it'll be driven by a much more timely and personalized way to get information from the assessment system.
Thank you so much. Any final questions before we let the Lieutenant Governor go? Great. Thank you so much for coming and testifying today. An honor to have you.
Thank you for all your work, and have a good time here in our snowy state. Snow, snow, snow.
Thanks, Lieutenant Governor. So I want to introduce our next panel, which has 5 distinguished members, and this is going to work sort of like the Price is Right showcase showdown here. I'm going to call you up, and if you can, we'll start from the right and move this way. So first is our superintendent, Mr. Tom Boasberg, superintendent of Denver Public Schools, is going to come and join us. Delighted to have him here. Also delighted to welcome Mr. Dennis Van Roekel, who's the president of the National Education Association. Welcome, and thank you so much for being here. Dr. King Alexander, who is the president of Cal State University Long Beach. Miss Aqua Stovall, who is the principal of Arthur Ashe Charter School in New Orleans. She said that the weather is just like this in New Orleans right now. And Dr. Dan Goldhaber, who is a research professor from the Center on Reinventing Public Education at the University of Washington. So come on in. I think it's Boasberg, you're on the far right here, and then Van Roekel, and then Dr. King, Dr. Alexander.
I like to think of myself on the far left.
They say that about you. So again, the structure for this morning is going to be, we're going to ask each of our distinguished panelists here to make some opening statements, about 5 to 7 minutes long, about their preliminary thoughts on this question. And then after each of them has made some preliminary statements, we're going to then open it up to back and forth questions from the panel, from the commissioners for the whole panel. And so that would be great. And we will start with you, Tom. Thanks so much for being here.
Great. So thank you, and also would like to extend a welcome to Colorado. I think we are, as Lieutenant Governor stated, have a remarkable set of opportunities in Colorado, given the level of dialogue and cooperation we have across the political spectrum and between our districts and between our Teachers Association. As we talk today about NCLB reauthorization, I really appreciate the focus on people and teacher effectiveness. I think too much of education reform over the last couple of decades is really focused on the piece of the iceberg that's above the water, which is seen as easily, attackable and reachable curriculums, programs, assessment. And the 90% of the iceberg that's below the water, people don't often want to talk about or address or think about, and that 90% really is people, which is how do we do a much, much better job attracting and retaining and rewarding, and where necessary, replacing people to make sure we have the most effective teachers in our classrooms and school leaders in our schools. So I really welcome this opportunity to talk about the big piece of the iceberg that's below the water. And I think in Colorado, and I'll speak specifically about Denver, I think we have done a lot over the last decade to really begin to focus on these sets of issues, and I think we've done so with a couple key priorities that have guided us. First and foremost is really to focus on what are our policies that produce the best opportunities and outcomes for our students? That has to be the lens through which we view this. And secondly, that it needs and it must be done cooperatively between districts and with our teachers. And I think when we look at, for example, ProComp and the multi-year cooperative element between the district and our Denver Classroom Teachers Association to develop and implement ProComp is clearly an example of that. Another example of that is the work that we have done with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation applying for their teacher effectiveness program, a very close collaboration between the Denver Public Schools and DCTA, and really trying to look at what our practices have been. And I think what the Gates Foundation has done on that is exactly right, which is they have said that we care deeply about districts doing two things. First is making sure that you're really willing to tackle the most difficult issues and look at fundamental substantive change. And secondly, that needs to be done collaboratively at the local level. You know, we've worked collaboratively also with the National Teachers Association as well through that Gates process. And I think that really sets up a good model for all of us in terms of putting down some of our traditional ideological swords and shields on these issues and coming into the room and having a dialogue and making sure that those dialogues are dialogues that go both ways. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit, because the systems and the practices and the cultures that we have are not merely because teachers did something or principals did something or administrators did something. It's an entire cycle when we need to look at all sides of that cycle. You know, I think as we look forward on the teacher effectiveness side, we see several key initiatives, and they're around recruiting, developing, retaining, and where necessary, replacing our educators. On the recruiting side, Barbara also, Lieutenant Governor, talked about the need to make sure we have multiple paths for recruitment. And I also think a couple key elements that we think are very important on this front. One is that we have programs and teacher training programs that really stress practical experience. I think the best way to hire a teacher is based on judging his or her performance in the classroom and having programs that really stress that practical experience. I think that diversity is critical for systems like ours to make sure that we're really reaching out and capturing a more diverse group of educators to reflect the diversity of our students and to fully capture the talent pool that's out there. And thirdly, that recruitment and placement is done by mutual consent. Schools are cultures. They need to be able to form and strengthen those cultures. And systems that we and other school systems have of forced placement, where we're forcibly placing a teacher against his or her consent or against the consent of that school leadership team, I think are wrong, and I think they're particularly wrong because they disproportionately affect our highest needs, lowest income schools, where you see the greatest proportion of the vacancies and the greatest proportion of the forced placements. On the development side, I think there needs to be a much greater focus on mutual development of both principals and teachers, and have coaching and have assessment and evaluation systems that are not gotcha systems or geared solely towards evaluation. The whole purpose of evaluation must be towards development and identifying strengths and weaknesses and how we can better develop our teachers and our principals. You know, I think on this point, our Teachers Association came up a couple of years ago and said, we want to make sure we have teacher evaluations of principals. And I think our knee-jerk reaction, this is where you get back to the ideological swords and shields, was, oh no. And I think the more we thought about it, the more we thought, oh yes, I mean, this is exactly what we need to do to make sure we're having this feedback process go both ways. And so our leaders are learning from our teachers, and our teachers are also learning from our leaders. So very quickly on retention, and then I'll pass on. You know, I do think we have a lot more to do in terms of recognizing our more outstanding teachers, around rewarding them. I think our tenure systems that give school systems a choice after 3 years of effectively giving someone what's effectively a lifetime right of employment, or forbidding them from ever working in the district again. I think to be making that choice with a 25-year-old teacher does not make sense. And I think we need to have more flexible tenure systems that grants tenure when ready and has significant professional and financial rewards associated with that. To your question, Dr. Ortiz, about about payment. I think we need to have compensation systems that do reward performance, and such that our high-performing teachers can stay in the classroom and can significantly increase their compensation over their careers to be highly compensated. But that requires differentiation. You can't have a system like ours and many other systems where 99% of our teachers get one rating, which is satisfactory. We need to be willing to differentiate. We need to be willing to take on and look at total compensation, not just pay, not just salary, but also pension. You know, we're paying something like $80 to $90 million a year out of a $500 million operating budget on our pensions. And we need to think carefully not only of how we make sure our pensions are fully funded and financially viable, but that they make effective human resource policy around retaining and rewarding our most effective teachers. And lastly, I think we need to have a much greater focus on how we reward teachers and school leaders who work in our highest need schools, right? If we're really serious about closing the achievement gap and dramatically reducing our dropout rates, we must be willing to put in both financial and non-financial sets of incentives and rewards for our teachers and school leaders to teach in our highest need schools and meet our most significant challenges. So with that, I'd like to thank you and open to questions. I am going to swap out with our wonderful Chief of Human Resources, Shane Spalton, for our panel, as I got another engagement I'm going to have to go to a little later on.
Thank you so much, Superintendent Boasberg. Great to have you. We are going to hear testimony from all the witnesses before we start Q&A, so we'll rely on Shane for that. Thanks so much. Mr. Van Roekel, welcome to Denver. Thanks so much for being here, and love to hear from you.
Thank you very much. I am Dennis Van Roekel. I'm a high school math teacher for 23 years. I grew up in a small town in Iowa, 1,700. Decided in 7th grade I was going to be a teacher, and for 23 years I got to live that dream. I also got involved in the association for a very important reason. You know, my first year, I think I was like everybody else. I figured if I cared enough and I worked hard enough, I could deliver whatever my students needed. But then the realization comes that there are so many decisions made outside of my room that impact my students that if I really want to advocate for them and for my profession, I have to have a place to be, an organization to be in. And that's why I do both. I believe the Commission has framed this discussion very well. You've put forth a hypothesis that if teachers and principals are one of the most important factors in student success, then there are some important questions to address. Number one, how do you measure that effectiveness of both teachers and principals? Two, how do we attract, prepare, support, and retain effective teachers and principals? It's a look at the profession, which I think is excellent. Thirdly, how do we ensure that disadvantaged students have access to highly effective teachers and principals? And then how can the federal government, through ESEA reauthorization, effectively support teachers and principals? I gave you a lot in written comments. I just want to address briefly in those four. In terms of measuring effectiveness, it's no secret the NEA does not support a single test measure being a primary criterion for measuring teacher success. There are a lot of reasons for that. There's the lack of research, for one. Being able to determine the impact of one teacher. Is it a leftover from last year's teacher, or is it what I'm doing? Not taking into account factors of absenteeism, turnover, and all of those things. But it's also from the point of view of the practitioner. My last year in the classroom, I taught 2 general math classes, 1 geometry, and 2 pre-calculus classes. 160 students. And at the end of the year, all 160, if they take a test, by which one am I measured? And do you judge my work the same in all 3 of those preparations, in all 5 of those classes? Does the same effective measures that I needed in one class, are the same ones required in another class? From my perspective, the answer is no. Not even in 2 general math classes in the same year can I use the same practice because they are different students in there. So we do not believe that that test measure is a single one. There is another model out there for measuring the effectiveness of teachers, and that's the National Board of Professional Teaching Standards. It focuses on the practice of doing the profession. Over 20 years, they spent $200 million developing assessments about what a teacher ought to know and be able to do. And what you need to know in early childhood or high school math is not the same. And so can we develop assessments for all ranges of what you teach and who you teach, and then it focuses on what you're able to do? It insults me, frankly, when someone says or believes that anyone with a degree in math can do what I do in a classroom. as if knowing how to do the problems in the book make it all happen. So the focus on the practice of the profession is very important. Looking at the continuum of the profession, attracting, preparing, supporting, and retaining. What is our current model? There are some colleges of education that accept anyone who applies. There are preparation institutions that are accredited and those that are not. There are some programs where you have a 5-week intensive course, some where you take 4 years of undergraduate and you're done and you graduate, some that it's a 5th degree program. Very different in what they require. And then the induction. We have 3 to 5 years where you need only tell them at the end of the year, teaching is not your profession. But what do we do to them in those 3 to 5 years? Is there intensive evaluation of their practice? Is there a built-in professional development system that says, here's where you're deficient in planning, in classroom control? What is it to build them in their profession? No second-year teacher believes they were as good the first year as the second. But what do we do in that system? Most times, in most circumstances, we go into the classroom, somebody comes in for 20 minutes a year and writes an evaluation. It's horrible that that's how we induct professionals into the profession. And then once we give them tenure or the right to due process, there is no professional development system. The school buys a new smart board. How am I supposed to know how to use that? Is there professional development built in? And then 5 or 10 years later, we sit and wonder, how in the world did we end up where we are? And you know, if a magic wand, every bad principal, teacher disappeared, you have not solved the problem, because there is a whole system of recruitment, training, induction, evaluation that is not being done, and simply removing those who shouldn't be there does nothing to change the system. The system must be changed. There is another model. And that is when we talk about Finland or Singapore, the ones that we're always compared to. What they do is they take undergraduates, they recruit from the top 1/3. Then they put them in a master's degree program in an academy to train teachers. They recruit from the top 1/3. You're paid a beginning teacher salary, but you are not a teacher of record until you complete that program. It's about the outputs of you as a professional, day in and day out. The ability to diagnose what a student needs, provide and develop lessons to meet those needs. So there's a very different model. We could look at that. And then the third one about ensuring disadvantage, let me just say briefly, NEA is taking this on full steam. We have a $6 million program called Priority Schools. We just had a 2-day conference where we invited state leaders, members from departments of education to say, how do we in a partnership change what's happening? It's wrong what's happening. The least prepared, the least experienced are being put into buildings of students with the greatest need. And we need to change that. We've interviewed 2,000 nationally board certified teachers in 6 states saying, what would it take for you to go there? What would it take for you to go there? We know that number 1, it's leadership. They will not go to a building with a bad principal. Number 2, they want to be part of a team that takes collective responsibility for the education of the students. They want different learning and working conditions. And yes, they want more money, but that's not the number 1. And lastly, I'll say on No Child Left Behind, it's been said before, I've watched 25 years of ed reform efforts since Nation at Risk in April of 1983. I've seen hundreds start and fail. I've seen little campfires of excellence that continue to burn, but never a brush fire that encompasses the system. My lesson learned from 25 years of watching and engaging in it is if you do not have a partnership between the management, the school board or the government entity, and the employees, including their union, it will not succeed. It's a waste of time, money, and effort, and the students deserve better. So whatever we do in the reauthorization of ESEA, we have to quit defining the how, be very clear on outcomes that we want for students in America, but give states and locals the flexibility to build partnerships to determine how to get there. Our students deserve more. NEA will be the greatest asset and backer. And number 1, the status quo is not acceptable. We cannot continue where we are. Number 2, the system must change. Not tinker around the edges. It's transforming into a system that is truly designed to educate every child in America. Currently, it is not designed that way. And thirdly, that it be student or learner-centered. We need to do what's right for students, and the rest will fall into place. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much for your testimony. Going to move next to Dr. Alexander, the president of Cal State University, Long Beach. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Senator, and thank you, Commission, for this opportunity. Most outside California know California State University probably for its EAP program, which has been recognized by the Spellings Commission, which is an early assessment placement program, which we developed to test juniors to determine whether those juniors are college ready in math and English by the end of their junior year. It's a warning. It's a heads-up warning system. We now have 75% of California's juniors taking this exam. In our school district in Long Beach, we have 94% of the students taking it, and we've mandated it for all juniors. What that does is it shows you the role of the California State University in getting into the public schools, but also devising systems that let families, schools, and others know where their juniors are prior to moving into their senior year, so they don't waste their senior year. But more importantly, the California State University is the largest supplier of teachers in the United States. We graduate about 12,000 teachers a year. My campus alone has about 950 graduates that go out each and every year into the local school districts. 9 years ago, we took it upon ourselves to start evaluating the teachers that we send out by talking with the school leaders, principals, and doing surveys in all kinds of areas, understanding the curriculum, planning and instruction, student rapport and motivation, understanding student diversity, teaching English language learners, managing student outputs, as well as teaching students equitably. We've been receiving data now for 9 years and comparing ourselves with one another within the 23 university system. And we know where our teachers fall. We know where our weaknesses are in these specific areas, and that tells us where our programs need to improve. It also shows us where our strengths are within our various programs, within our 23 campuses throughout the state. Currently, we've had, in this last 9 years, 93,000 graduates go into the public schools in California. 50,000 of those went into urban schools. 21,000 went into rural schools, and 22,000 went into suburban schools throughout the state of California. As you know, we have some of the largest schools in the United States and not very well funded, so our teachers have to take this burden on as they move forward. But our colleges of education and our Center for Teacher Quality in the CSU system has been doing a number of innovative things, including these evaluations. These are two-way evaluations as well, because we also ask our first-year and second-year teachers to report back on deficiencies that they feel that they have that we did not prepare them for in our colleges of education. If indeed our teacher does not pass certain standards that the school leadership has assessed them on and evaluated them, we in Long Beach have a teacher warranty program where the school and the teacher can come back and be educated in any of the areas that I just mentioned. They don't have to pay, neither does the school district. This is a teacher warranty program that we provide throughout our school district. Our school district has 90,000 students, just to let you know how large. It's the same size as Detroit, Michigan, just in the Long Beach city schools. Further evaluative techniques that we have embarked upon is not just evaluating teachers through online evaluations and surveys. We're also matching the California Standards exam that's given each and every year, particularly for our elementary school students, and working through 8 years of data to identify where our teachers have been strong and where they have been weak, according to student test scores and student learning results that are annually supplied to us and annually made available to us. We have a number of our school districts working very closely, and it's in the data swapping that we do so that we can understand, and this is not aimed at the specific teacher necessarily. What this is aimed to do is to tell us within our programs where we are strong and where we are weak based on the standardized exams that our students are taking. This is the first that we believe nobody else in the country has even gone this far to study within the classroom and to take longitudinal data to analyze where our programs are strong, to compare those programs with one another within the CSU system, within our 23 universities, to find out where the average is, where we should be, where some of the higher achieving schools or colleges of education, whether it's in math or English or other areas. So we don't have the data back from this new assessment technique that we're using, but that will come to us in about less than a year. So we'll have a much better understanding of not only the evaluations that are done with our school leaders that evaluate back to us on an annual basis about the effectiveness of our first and second year teachers, as well as the teachers reporting back to us, but we will have longitudinal test result data indicating where our colleges are weak, where our colleges of education are strong, what areas do we need to emphasize more on, how much math do our teachers need to be studying, because we'll be able to compare certain math teachers that have had more math, certain types of math proficiencies, as compared to other math teachers who may have had less math and be more general. So these are new. We believe they will help us understand our colleges of education where we are doing much more. And we do believe that this is the type of longitudinal data as well as the type of partnerships that we have with our local school districts. And that is the critical element in all this, is being able to work closely with your partnerships with your school districts. In Long Beach, we have one of the best student tracking systems, and President Obama mentioned Long Beach and Houston, Texas, as having the two best tracking systems from pre-kindergarten all the way through doctoral degree. And we're tracking each and every one of our students, and these are very large schools. You have to keep in mind our high schools have about an average of about 5,000 students in each high school in Long Beach. And we're among one of the most diverse communities in the United States with very high free lunch numbers, very high poverty numbers. So it's not that we're a wealthy district working with wealthy students. We're a large urban district doing a lot of things, and it starts with the type of partnerships that you have with your public schools. Are you sharing data? Are you working together to improve the teacher, the colleges of education, but also the teachers that we're producing? And currently 80% of the teachers in Long Beach are hired from our program, because of the collaboration between our local school district and our university. So thank you for letting me share this information with you, and I look forward to also answering any of your questions regarding our efforts to be more innovative in the evaluation areas.
Thank you so much, Dr. Alexander. Delighted to have next Ms. Aqua Stovall, who is here from New Orleans and leads one of the highest performing and fastest improving schools in New Orleans. So delighted to hear about you and your work in New Orleans.
Thank you, Senator, and thank you, Commission, for having me here today. I have the privilege to lead a school in New Orleans where Katrina washed away the school district, and we're rebuilding an urban school district from the ground up. And I think nowhere else in the country that anyone can say that. It has its pros and its cons, but I'm watching a school system where no school ever succeeded before, to where that is not the status quo anymore. If we're not meeting the standards, they're going to shut the school down. But one thing we have a serious problem with in New Orleans is teacher retention, is that everybody wants to come to New Orleans, but then once they get there, they say, principals say, oh my goodness, they're leaving faster than they came in. So there are some things that, when the commission asked me to come and speak, like, what do principals need to retain teachers? And the first thing is effective teacher training programs, and not just ed programs, but also great alternative certification programs. I'm in a charter school, so where we also can take teachers who are not certified yet and train them to become great teachers. But we need great alternative certification programs to help support us, not just to say, yes, we're going to give them their certification, but actually give them adequate training and support to make sure that they can successfully lead children and make them perform in a global economy. And something else is quality of professional development, not just from the teacher training programs, but also from schools. Schools have to support their teachers. They have to make teachers feel like that they are set up for success, where they come to work every day and they can actually see adequate gains in their students. I feel like at Arthur Ashe that we have provided that, but that is not the norm in most urban schools. Most urban schools, teachers do not feel like they are set up for success. They don't feel like they have the tools that they need. I'm blessed that I am able to provide quality professional development for my teachers, but this needs to be across the board in all schools. Teachers need to feel like they are working in an environment that has a strong sense of mission and teamwork, that they are players at the table. Everything is not top down, that they have a say-so in their schools. We need a community to rebuild a school, and that means everyone involved in this process. And empowering them to educate themselves when they don't feel like that they have the resources. Not just put them in a box to say, this is what you have to do, and this is the time frame you have to do it in, but actually giving them the tools to empower themselves. And one thing that I think I see principals burn out all across New Orleans all the time, a year or two, and then they say, we can't do this anymore because of the hard work. And I think that that we need to look at what can we do to retain great leaders. And the one thing is a sense of stability. It's providing principals with the tools that they need to say, you know what, I can get this work done in a timely manner. Yes, principals work long hours, but they also need to know that there's light at the end of the tunnel. And so last year when I had my results back, I was like, you know what, this hard work paid off, so it makes me work even harder. But everybody doesn't see that because they don't have the support system from their district to have that. Having total autonomy, it's the best thing in the world in my school. So I see a light at the end of the tunnel. I know that I am able to make changes, and I'm held accountable for those changes, yes, but I have the power to do that. So some things that I do feel like I've noticed for great schools and great teacher retention is teaching them how to plan, not just for teaching and learning, but also for school culture and behavior. I think so many new teachers are thrown into a system, and they don't really understand that school culture and behavior is so important in leading instruction. You can't teach a child anything if you don't have that classroom under control. Using that data to drive instruction. Are teacher programs really training teachers on how to use data? Do they understand that they cannot make an instructional decision without that data? Also, principals developing their staff, not just throwing them away because they're struggling. What support systems are in place for these teachers? What support systems are in place for struggling principals too? Is this going to be a recyclable system? No, because children need stability. And also the feedback. I'm in classes every single day, and that should be the norm across schools. Principals should be instructional leaders and building an inspirational and motivational culture in schools. So many schools want to focus just on test scores. Are they important? Yes, they are, because kids have to perform. But do they believe in themselves that they can accomplish anything? I teach in an urban area where most of my students are on not free and reduced lunch, but free lunch. And I have to teach them that they can do this. But then I have to also instill that in the staff. So it's just not all about the test scores, but how are we training adults to lead children, and how are we training the leaders to lead the adults in their buildings?
Thank you so much. I'm sure we'll have lots of questions for you when it comes around. Last but certainly not least, delighted to have Dr. Dan Goldhaber here from the Center for Reinventing Public Education. Anxious to hear what you have to say. Thanks for coming.
How's that? All right. So just to repeat, I'm going to be talking about using value-added models. I'm only going to get about this far into the statistical weeds. So let me just say, my comments are specifically focused on the idea of using statistical models that attempt to isolate the contribution that teachers make to student achievement. And just to set the stage, and I know that I'm probably preaching to the choir because you all know the importance of teachers and principals, but we basically differentiate teachers in three ways in terms of all of the human capital policies. We differentiate them in terms of licensure, they are or are not licensed. We differentiate them in terms of their degree level, and we differentiate them in terms of experience. And there's pretty good evidence that licensure and degree level, although we use them for policy purposes, really don't provide a good indicator of teacher quality as measured by their value-added contribution to student learning. We know that teachers get a lot better in their first couple years in the classroom, but even then there's a lot of overlap in distribution. So there are a lot of first-year teachers that turn out to be more effective than third-year teachers, and third-year teachers that are more effective than first-year teachers. So even though it's predictive of teacher effectiveness, I wouldn't bet my house that a third-year teacher was more effective than a first-year teacher. I might put a couple $100 on it, but you're still only making probably a 60% bet. It's better than flipping a coin, but it's certainly not perfect. So the idea is that we ought to be focused instead of these inputs on judging teachers based on outcomes, i.e. what they're contributing to student achievement. And when it comes to judging teachers based on outcomes, there are basically at least 5 or 6 things that folks are concerned about. And again, I'm gonna just touch on all of them, but I would urge you to dig into the literature that I provided and some references that are in that literature to get in more depth. So the first issue is, should we even be using student tests as a metric for teacher effectiveness? And this goes to a much larger issue that we face as a school system, because NCLB certainly used student tests. Personally, I think there's very good evidence that both on an individual level, how well students do on these tests affects their later life outcomes, and on a national level, there's really good emerging evidence that it affects our competitiveness as a nation. Second issue is the issue of bias. Do these value-added measures accurately predict the contribution that teachers are making, as opposed to what you might see because of the makeup of classrooms? So you want to try and isolate the contribution of teachers and not judge the fact that a teacher, for instance, might have the honors class or might be teaching a more remedial class. And there's an emerging literature about bias and whether these measures actually handle bias well. Even if they handle bias well, tests are measured with error. Wow, I'm already blinking green. Tests are measured with error. So anytime you draw hard and fast lines, and you're probably going to make errors on either side of the line. So if you reward teachers who fall into the top quintile of performance, you might wonder whether the teacher at the 79th percentile is really different from the teacher at the 81st percentile. And anytime you draw those lines, that's going to be a problem. I would note, though, that we're drawing those lines now. We draw those lines with regards to master's degree, we draw them with regards to experience. And we know with some of the lines that we're drawing that they're not very good lines to be drawing. We worry about perverse incentives. Would using these measures cause teachers to not to collaborate as much? Would it cause them to teach to the test? Those kind of issues. We worry about what is the comparison group. So do we compare teachers within a school? Do we compare them within a school district? Do we compare them within a state? And lastly, there are lots of logistical issues that come up around using tests as a metric for teacher success, about the timing of tests and whether they're actually capturing a year that the students are with the teacher, about the length of time it takes to get feedback, and about all the areas that are not tested. So in question and answer, if that issue comes up, I'll try and address some of those issues. So this is just Dan's opinion. All right, what I've tried to say thus far is sort of the research around value-added modeling. I personally think that it is absolutely worth experimenting with using value-added modeling for making personnel decisions. That the reason it's worth thinking about that is because the other way that we might differentiate teachers is through a teacher evaluation system. And this was discussed earlier, that there's overwhelming evidence that we don't do that. And there are probably some political and cultural reasons that we don't do it, but basically, almost all teachers that come up for tenure get tenure. Almost all teachers, if you look at any rating system, fall into the top rating. So there are no consequences for having differentiation in terms of a teacher success. And when you have a system like that, you're not encouraging that kind of success. So the status quo is not setting a very high bar for an alternative. And I think that oftentimes when we talk about value-added models, we talk about it as if the alternative is a nirvana. And the alternative we know very well is not a nirvana. So I wouldn't want to rely entirely on value-added models, but I think that there's some really good evidence that we ought to be experimenting with using them for more teacher policies. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. A wonderful group of testimony. There'll be many questions. Shane, do you want to come on up and join us in case folks have questions that are specific to DPS? I'll start with the first question, and I might come back to you, Dan. We've talked a lot about teacher effectiveness as a measurement. One of the concerns that is out there is, and you mentioned a little bit about the value-added challenge, is that there may be different challenges for moving the value-added meter based on different populations of students. So there are both those that believe that if you have really low-performing students, it's harder to show growth, or if you have really high-performing students, it's harder to show growth, or some would say if you have middle-performing students, it's harder to show growth. Is there some confidence that there are statistical measures that make it possible for there to be a value-added measure that works relatively fairly for all three of those different groups, or is that a problem we're still trying to solve?
so it'd be easy for me to get deeper into the weeds on this question, and I'll try not to. There are statistical ways that you can try and account for this. You can look at teachers only within bands of student achievement and make sure that those are the kinds of comparisons that you're making. Another issue is that you want to have tests that are appropriately scaled so that growth at different points in the student achievement distribution it really is comparable. So probably value-added measures put a higher premium on having a really well thought out testing system. So in short answer to your question, I don't think that we know all of the ramifications. But if you've got a system where it is easier to show value-added growth at some places in the distribution and not others, then you know that there's something that is wrong with the way that you are estimating your value added. Because the whole idea of value added is that you're measuring the distance that students travel with certain teachers, not where they come into the classroom. And I think that that's an issue that people often confuse, is distance traveled versus where do students come in and what do they bring to the table with them.
And the value-added measure allows you to focus on that distance traveled rather than a starting point. Great.
Yeah, that's right.
I know there are many questions from the commissioners, so I'm going to step back and let whoever ready to jump in. Go ahead, Dr. Hanaway.
I'd like to first make a comment and then a request and then a question. The comment first, congratulations to Dr. Alexander. I serve on the Broad Review Prize, and Long Beach has been a school district that has won and has been nominated as a winner a number of times. And as the institution that provides 80% of the teaching staff to the district, I'm sure a lot of that credit should also go to you. So congratulations. Secondly, a request, and this is a request to Mr. Van Roekel. One of the recommendations you make in your prepared statements, and that you also did orally, is that one strategy that you would support for improving teacher practice is involvement in the National Board for Professional Standards certification process. I happen to have served on the National Academy of Science Board that reviewed the National Board work. And while it is the case that teachers who choose to go through that process tend to be more effective teachers, they tend to be more effective teachers even before they go through the process. And we found no evidence of it improving practice. Now, we finished our work about a year ago. If there's new evidence to the contrary on that, I personally would be very interested in it. I think the commission would be very interested in it if indeed this is a viable path for improving practice. But as far as I know, there's no evidence on that right now. Let me get to my question, and then you can address that too. My question is, and this was listening to your oral comments where you were talking about the use of test scores for determining teacher effectiveness, and what I wrote down is that you would not support it as a primary determinant. Does that mean that you would support it as a partial determinant, and could you expand on that a little bit?
On the second one, the answer is yes. Evidence of, I don't know what I do to turn it on. I don't think it was on the first time. What we talk about is evidence of student learning, that there are multiple measures, and so we support that, and obviously test scores would be one of those. We also talk about the difference in test scores between the standardized norm reference test given once a year versus other assessment tools that many districts have developed in terms of their curriculum standards and alignment within their own school district, and some states have done that. So to say that it's part of it, absolutely, but it's the overemphasis on as a primary measure that we most object to. On your comment on national board certification, I think it's very interesting what you're talking about is if I as an individual get national board certification, I go back into a school or district and I'm kind of one by myself or a couple of us, I think you're right. Evidence shows that it doesn't really impact the overall system. But where evidence does show that makes a tremendous impact is when they do it together within a school. One of the things that's in the last 3 years, they say everyone take one, where everyone on the faculty takes one part of it and they're doing it together. It becomes part of that embedded professional development, that it's not a workshop after school or on Saturday, but it's part and parcel of your job. That's what Finland and Singapore do, so that much of the measurement of outputs and determining whether it's a growth model or value added is assessing your practice as you go, so that there is more time built into your work day about analyzing how you did it and how do you know whether it made an impact. Just to give you one primary example about the National Board, there's a small school in Levine District in Phoenix. A young woman came back from National Board certification and got her entire faculty and principal to agree the next year to do that. And so they're constantly, all year long, working as a group, assessing performance in terms of what's happening to kids. And there's a school that has about 75% English language learners, 98% free and reduced lunch, and they're one of only 2 schools in the entire district that make adequate yearly progress. And they're in the highest crime area. But I think the key there is that it is a group of people, again, the employees of their union, the management in that building and of the district and the school board saying this is important, and working together they outline a plan to change what's happening to students, and it works.
Yeah, just to clarify, it certainly makes sense to me that some sort of ongoing process of assessment and feedback would help improve performance, but it was the leap to saying involvement in National Board certification leads to improved practice. And if we don't have to go into that anymore here, but if there is evidence to that effect, I think we would be very interested in seeing that, because we weren't able to find it in our review.
Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions? Danica?
Dr. Alexander, you talked about many of the success of the two-way evaluation system. Can you just tell us about some of the challenges that you came across?
Well, one of the challenges is exactly why we're moving forward on the new evaluation to add to it, which is you really can't assess student. It really doesn't have it has a student learning impact, and we can't make determinations on student learning. That's why we're trying to match what we're doing with the California Standards exam and working with our local school districts. But what differs and keeps us out of the sort of the political quagmire of it all is that we're not evaluating the individual teachers as much as we're evaluating what we're doing as a university and as a college, and where our strengths are and where our weaknesses are. So there are significant limitations to what we're doing, but the purpose of what we are doing is to say, 9 years ago, is to sit down and say, we just can't assume that 84% of our teachers going in their first year are proficient in mathematics or proficient in classroom management, which many places around the United States just make those assumptions because they were educated and they received a degree or certification. We're going out each and every year and we're comparing our numbers each and every year in these areas with what we did last year, with other CSU institutions, as well as with averages that we now have. So we do know 84% of our overall 84% of our first-year teachers are proficient in all these areas. Then we also find out but we also know in other areas only 68% are proficient in motivational techniques and preparedness. So we need to work harder as a college, and I'll point out also that it's not the College of Education's responsibility to produce a teacher, it's a university's responsibility. And our culture is very different on our campus, and our culture is very different. It's our #1 mission. We tell our faculty this because it has the most spillover effects of any graduate that we could put into the marketplace because of the lives that they're impacting throughout their career. So our culture is very accepting of our role in the schools. Our culture is accepting of our role to find out whether we are doing what we're saying we're doing. And that's why we're having to create these new models of self-evaluation. I wish they were out there, and there were many other models of self-evaluation that we could take advantage of. But one weakness is certainly is in value-added student learning, which we're moving into to determine how our teachers are improving in the value-added areas and the role that they're playing. in all of the proficiency areas that we're testing.
Thank you. Ms. Providence?
I have many questions, but I'll try to keep them brief. My first one is for everyone on the panel, anyone that would like to respond is, as we're here, we're thinking about teacher effectiveness and what an effective teacher looks like. So my question is, what are some components of good instructional practice that we need to see reflected in classrooms? That's part one. How should those components be evaluated, and how can we train to target those components? What I'm saying is, what makes a good teacher? What makes an effective teacher in a classroom? Can we put words? Can we describe that sort of teacher? Can we evaluate that kind of teacher? And can we train teachers to become that?
That's an easy one. No one wants to take that one?
I love that question. I ask myself that every day. I think one thing that, as a principal, I look for is the person in the classroom understands what they're teaching. Like, they understand the content area or the primary area, whatever that is that they're teaching. They understand the state standards. And they understand how to deliver those standards to children and knowing how to reach them. And another thing I think that describes a great teacher is reflection. And as I mentioned before, is training teachers on how to reflect on their process and on their day, from that day-to-day instruction by using the data. What are you doing every day to make sure that your students understand, and how are you reflecting on that process? And once you reflect on that process, what are you doing about it if they didn't get it? So I think that's like very important for a teacher. Another thing is, this is something that I don't think you can teach somebody, is just to have empathy for children, and that they want to be there and change the lives of kids. You can have all of the content knowledge in the world, but do you truly love children, and are you there every day to drive student achievement and to instill something in the child? And I do believe, as a principal, I have to evaluate that. Their ability to connect to the children. I evaluate how they're using the data to drive the instruction every day, and I also evaluate, are you teaching the standards? Is your class rigorous? And yes, you can teach that with modeling with them, sitting down, planning with them, and sitting down and teaching them how to break apart a standard to make sure that the teacher understands this is the end goal and how do you get there. So starting from the beginning, you know where you need to go. How do you get there? It's a lot on an instructional leadership team for school, but it's necessary. I hope
And I'd like to add that those models also are sort of moving targets, and they evolve. 10 years ago, we would not even be assessing our teachers on teaching English learners, on how effective they're doing with the English learners. We wouldn't have moved it. We wouldn't even be looking, the understanding the curriculum has changed considerably. Student rapport and motivation with today's students, with today's children, is a moving, changing target, and understanding student diversity in places like where we are. 10, 15 years ago, these are areas that our teachers have had to expand to. The utilization of technology. Our teachers now, especially our younger teachers, are much better with technology, and quite frankly, I receive an update every 5:30 on every day. The teachers input what my children did in the public schools, and I receive an email telling me what they did that day, every day, from 6th grade through senior year in high school. Every child that has access to a computer will find out what their children did that day and what's expected of them in the next week and a half. And it's the teachers that are doing this. The teachers are utilizing these new instructional techniques, utilizing new technologies and I don't know of a greater parental involvement tool than the one that I have in my pocket right now. And so it's a moving target. The models, trying to model this in an environment that's moving as quickly as it has been, requires new energy. It requires our new teachers to be more accepting. And we heard this a little bit earlier from about our newer teachers. And what concerns me is that every time we hit a state budget decline, guess who are the first teachers to be released? It's based on seniority. It's not based on effectiveness. It's not based on what new models are being developed. It's based on the students that you did everything you can to get your best and brightest in the classroom. You even worked with the federal government to relieve them of student indebtedness programs. We got them there, and then they're the first to go when our budgets take such roller coaster rides, and then they go on to other things.
I could add just a couple thoughts. They hit a lot of the things about the cultural awareness and understanding students and the content knowledge and the skills that are very definitely teachable about classroom management and so on. There are two things that I would add that I think are very important. I think many assume that it's a presentation skill, and I don't believe that. I believe it is an adaptation of presentation skills. I planned so many lessons so well that 10 minutes into it, watching their faces, I knew it wasn't working, and I had to change right then. It's knowing and reading that face of whether or not it's working or not. And if it's not working, you have to change right then. You can't say, well, tomorrow I'll come back and teach differently. You have to, and that's professional skill. You develop that over time, but you have to adapt to what's going on in that room. And the second thing is all of us are very different. I'm a loud teacher. I don't sit quietly, I just can't. And I'll never be like some of my colleagues who are very effective with their students, but who have very different personalities. So part of what I think is so important is developing and adapting skills to fit me so that I'm effective with students. I can't do it just the way someone else does it, but I can take those kinds of, whether it's about classroom management or developing plans or motivating students or connecting with them or understanding cultural awareness, all of those things have to be built into me to make me effective. And that understanding that if each of us do that in our own way, we are better for students. Don't make me into my colleague next door. Make me the best I can be in who I am. And that's a part I think is so often left out of the dialogue.
So just really quickly, I don't think there's a satisfying answer to your question. And were there a satisfying answer, we probably wouldn't be here. You know, there's a lot of research on what are the kinds of practices, certifications, courses, et cetera, that make people effective. And there's not much of those inputs that seem to be strongly correlated with how effective people are. And it's probably because, like in all walks of life, you can be effective in many different ways. And also, I just would distinguish between the question of what makes an individual effective from what are the policy levers that we can pull to make individuals effective. And I think those are two fundamentally different questions, because even if we could define individual effectiveness for policymakers, they really need to know, well, if we require that somebody takes a certain course or gets a certain certification, will they be more effective? And those are fundamentally different questions.
And Dan, my second question was actually for you. Very interested in value added. I work in DC, and that's part of our evaluation system. So my question is, I guess I have two. How are good assessments generated, and what do you think is a good way to measure that value added? Would it be best to measure it on an individual basis in the classroom? Would it be best to measure teacher A from environment A with teacher B within the same environment? Would it be good to measure teacher A in environment A with teacher B in environment B? What's a good way to measure?
So I can't really answer your question well here, but I'd say there are a couple sort of baselines that you'd want to start from. You absolutely want to measure growth. So you don't want to measure the level of student achievement. You want to see the progress that students make while they're with a certain teacher. So that's the first thing. Second, you want to try and compare teachers who have like students. So that's probably really, that's certainly very important, and it probably has implications for the level of the comparison. So it's probably difficult to do that if you're only comparing teachers within the same school, because it's quite unlikely that you're going to be able to get apples to apples comparisons, because at the 4th grade in English language arts, there may not be 2 teachers that are teaching really 2 comparable classrooms. So the bigger the unit that you're looking at, the more likely that you're going to be able to get close to apples comparisons. The downside to that is that the bigger the unit, you begin to conflate the impact of the teacher and the impact of the principal. The research suggests that most of the variation in teacher effectiveness is within schools. So adding in kind of a principal control doesn't add much explanatory power, which implies that it probably is okay to have a comparison that cuts across different schools. So I'm not sure if I quite answered your question, but
I think in a way you have.
Also, Colorado actually has a system that does this, where they measure both student growth based on a cohort of students who have performed similarly over the last several years, and then they're comparing teacher growth on similarly situated cohorts. So there is some, Rich Wenning, who was here earlier, is the CDE person who's done that data system. So there is one example here of an attempt to do that. I have another question I'd love to jump in. Mr. Van Roekel was agreed very strongly with one of the comments you made about the challenges we see right now about principal support. One of the things we know is that principals either don't have the time or don't have the capacity to really provide the kind of high-quality instructional support that teachers need, and so we have a lot of situations where people are coming in not getting good coaching and then either getting non-renewed because they didn't get the support, or getting kept because they weren't performing well, but the teacher didn't have time to support them in improving. And so really interested in what your thoughts are about what we do to try and better define principal effectiveness, when the key measure here is how good is a principal at providing instructional support to their teachers. And so one of the ideas I've been really interested in is can we look at a measure of principal effectiveness that actually says principals are evaluated on 2 things. One is their own student achievement growth, and secondly, and most importantly, the effectiveness of their own teachers and the extent to which they're helping their teachers get better. When we say to principals, that's your job, that's what you do, and all you do, is that one way we can start to reorient them around the work that matters, which is supporting the teachers that aren't getting supported now?
Yesterday at the conference that we held, one member from the State Department of Education raised a very provocative question to me, to the group. She said, maybe what we're designing the job of principal is one that cannot be done by a single individual. When you make that person responsible for running the entity, the budgeting, the hiring, and all of the things that a principal is required to do, and on top of that say, and you must be the instructional leader, that it's an impossible task. There isn't enough time for a person to do all of that. Which then says, if that's true, if you accept that as a hypothesis, maybe that is an impossible task, what would be different? I think the model that we look at when we're studying Finland and some of these where it's embedded professional development, that by giving teachers time for collaboration and talking about students, that they become instructional leaders with each other, so that it isn't the responsibility of 1 or 2 people in a building of 60 staff. But I think it's a systems question we really have to ask. It's not fair to keep beating up principals because they're not spending time in the classroom if we designed a job that doesn't give them time to do that. And the real key is that collaboration of providing that leadership. When our nationally board certified, we asked them, that's what I think they were describing, and they said the power of being part of a team that had shared responsibility, meaning you have a great leader who recognizes teacher leadership and who allows that faculty together to be responsible for the learning that occurs in that building. So that's a little shift from what we currently think. But if we're going to give them the single responsibility, we're going to have to change what the other expectations are, so there's literally time to do that.
And I might just open it up to the panel. How do we measure then principal, even if there is this superhuman job, how do we either change the job description, or how are we going to get real accurate measurements of what principal effectiveness is other than the performance data of their kids or of their teachers? I think that's a really open and hard question for us. Would love anybody's feedback.
So I would use the performance data of their kids as one metric, but I also think that on more of an anecdotal level, but it just makes sense, we know that the kind of environment that principals create in a school is going to have a real profound impact on the teachers that end up staying there. So you might want to look at teacher attrition. You might want to look at the quality of recruitment. I think that everything that is involved with creating an effective staff, you would probably want to attribute to principals, maybe not directly, but maybe in terms of the way that they are managing their school. So they may not be involved directly in recruitment, but they know that they've got someone in place in the school, a team, a person, whoever, that is taking that as a very serious role. So I think that you'd probably want to measure in a variety of different ways that all focused around the quality of teachers that end up at schools and stay there.
It seems to me like part of the process then is actually working from the results backward, right? What we're doing now is we're finding schools that are significantly beating the odds, and we're saying, what are the characteristics of those principals that are helping get those results? So we know the outcomes we want, and it's a matter of talking to people like Aqua and saying, what are the practices and behaviors and training and supports that are leading to these outcomes, so we make those outcomes replicable, right? But it's the end results that are the place we know we want to start.
I think that's right, but again, I would caution the focus on behaviors, because we, as policymakers, you can't control behavior. All you can control is the requirements to be in a certain position, or the rewards associated with being in a certain position. And so to me, at least, the real question for policymakers is, what are the policies that are going to lead to the outcomes that we want, even if we could identify on a case-by-case basis what are the behaviors that get there. It's really the policies that we're focused on.
And those often include a combination of work conditions and autonomies and others, right?
I also think we would all love to think that our principals, our sole responsibility is support instruction of our teachers. But I'm just thinking of our EDD program and the classes that our principals take before to get an upper level degree. They've got to be well-versed in educational finance. They can't get out of there without having a course or two in educational law. They can't get out of there without knowing about the testing processes, the federal policies, and how do the whole accountability movement that they're required to play a role in, and how that's shifting and all this. So instruction's part of how they're educated. It's a percentage of what they do. But then you look at, as was pointed out earlier, you look at the full range of their global responsibilities on a campus, and from managing a budget, which is perhaps the most important part of their job, so that you can get enough teachers and you can control student-teacher ratios, to the legal impacts that come flying at you every 20% of the time, and special needs students as well. So we all wish that their jobs were much more simpler. Unfortunately, they've become masters of a very difficult environment in just about everywhere you see them.
Other questions from the commissioners?
Yes, this one's for
Dr.
Dan
Ortiz.
also. Dan, we know that there's some challenges in terms of using the value-added measures, and particularly in the adoption of them as a mechanism for evaluating teacher effectiveness. From your perspective, what features would be built into a policy to minimize or eliminate the objections to using the value-added?
So I would start with the quality of the tests. Obviously, if you're going to be judging somebody based on a certain outcome, they're going to be focused on that outcome. So I think that you want to make sure that if teachers are teaching to the test, and that's usually deemed a bad thing, though I would say it's not necessarily a bad thing, you want to make sure that people are teaching to a good test that's really accurately measuring the kind of student learning that we think is important. I think that ideally, as I said earlier, you want to make sure that the tests are set up structurally in a way that you're actually capturing the learning that's going on with particular teachers, and you can attribute learning to particular teachers, and that's a logistical problem that many school districts confront. Those are the places that I would start. I mean, I could go on, but those are really, I think that the place to start is around the testing. I guess I would also say that I would not see value-added measures as being the sole means of judging teachers. I think that value added could play a really valuable role as being an honest broker in terms of teacher evaluations. So you probably want more holistic measures, and having the objectiveness of value added will help to give you a sense of whether the other means, whether this is a supervisory rating or peer assessments or video assessments, however you're doing it, would help to give you a better sense of whether or not those assessments are actually rigorous. And I think that also value added might help you in areas that are not tested, in places where you can't do value added. So if you found that there was a distribution, you're differentiating teachers in grades and subjects where you have value added, but hey, in grades and subjects where you don't have value added, every teacher is excellent. That doesn't have much face validity, and I think that it would help school systems to confront that issue in a more forceful way.
Mike.
Please.
And this is for anybody on the panel who wants to address this, but former Governor Roemer from Colorado challenged us a year and a half ago and said, you know, we have all established our standards and we're teaching toward those standards, but in actuality we've missed the mark, that we need to be teaching the global standards, and several references have been made to how programs evaluate their teachers in other countries and how they do this types of thing. Did we miss the mark?
I'm glad that there's a lot of attention focused on that right now. The CCSSO, the chief state school officers, are looking at that. And they've got 47 states. And they make a very important distinction. These are not federal standards that are being handed down to states. It is 47 states who are working together to agree on what they ought to be, looking toward the 21st century, to make sure that if that's where we're aimed, and all of our efforts is to get to those standards, do we have the right standards for the 21st century? And I think as the more they look at that, the assessments become critically important, that we must design assessments that go beyond a bubble test, that be able to assess the skills of problem solving and creativity and developing the very skills we see as necessary. So I don't think we are there yet, and I welcome the attention made on saying, do we have the right standards?
Rigor. The question of rigor is a significant one, and in fact, I didn't mention why we had to create the EAP program at the junior year. It's because a high school exit exam in California doesn't test college readiness. And so the students were getting out with less, so we had to create an exam at the end of their junior year to let them know whether they were college ready at the end of their junior year prior to their senior year, so they could beef up their senior year and put more rigor into their senior year. Otherwise, they're finding out that they're not ready. They're not ready to go to college at the end of their senior year, and that exam by itself we don't accept as being an exam that tests college readiness, either for the UCs or the California State Universities.
Shane, you're basically running the Denver Pro-Comp program right now, and as I mentioned earlier, it really is a forerunner of a lot of what people are talking about. Can you help us understand? Well, as Dan said, policy can only do so much. You know, it can set up incentives, it can set up regulations. Can you help us understand the ways in which and the extent to which state and federal incentives and regulations have promoted or retarded what you're trying to accomplish?
So I think in many ways, Pro-Comp allowed us to think about this issue of teacher effectiveness 10 years before this dialogue is starting. And so it was really an opportunity to start to say we're going to look very closely at performance at the school level, at the individual teacher level, and we're going to recognize and reward excellence that we see at that level. The challenge now, I think, is moving beyond our initial versions of Pro-Comp. So I think our initial versions of Pro-Comp were really an attempt to come up with what we saw as our first take on those measures of effective teaching. And if you look at our Pro-Comp program, it's a complicated program. We have a lot of surrogates in there, whether they're measures of knowledge and skill, whether they're measures of student growth, that try to get at this issue of what makes an effective teacher and collect all of those pieces into one place. I think the way in which state and federal policy will help drive us further is to encourage more comprehensive measures of teacher effectiveness and encourage differentiation. There are places within our current pro-comp system where I think we can leverage, more effectively. One of the examples would be the element of pro-comp for which we reward teachers for satisfactory evaluations. That is still a component of our evaluation system, but as you heard Superintendent Boasberg speak, 99% of our teachers are receiving that incentive for a satisfactory evaluation. I think there are places within state and federal law that we can encourage the kind of differentiation that really allows us to recognize, reward excellence in a more significant way. I think ways in which state and federal policy can also push compensation structures, evaluation structures, to consider those measures for which we see research that links it very directly with that links measures very directly with student outcomes, I think is another significant way in which I think would push these initial pay for performance systems that are out there. The example of that is that we do have an element of pro-comp that rewards for advanced degrees within our pro-comp system. We need to understand better whether that lever or whether there are other levers that more significantly would drive towards the student outcomes that we're looking for.
I ask one further question. We tend to talk about teachers as if we're talking about a homogeneous group. And there are elementary school teachers and there are secondary school teachers, just to do a crude break. Do people on the panel think that we should be thinking about different policies for different categories of teachers? Dan, you want to take that on?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I think that's right, and there are a lot of other ways that teachers might be differentiated beyond the grade level. So I think that there are lots of different ways that we could think of different, career hierarchies and differentiated roles. And it's certainly the case that what teachers would need to bring to the classroom is going to be different depending on the level, the kind of the subject you're teaching, et cetera. And that's probably just the first place where you would think about differentiating. So in short, yes.
Did you want to jump in, Mr. Roberts? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I'd say the financial structure is pretty important in this. I think, and that's, my colleagues may disagree, but they probably won't. The best education dollar spent in a kindergarten room. The most learning improvement, the most significant, and we have inversely funded education, where generally the least amount of funding is going at the lowest level. The highest amount of funding ultimately filters its way up to the highest level, right to the doctoral programs, which have the smallest class sizes. But the weed-out process has already hit in ways that they didn't even get to college. So financially, we know that if you have a dollar to spend it in education, the best place to put it is in kindergarten. And we know that could have the most significant improvement. And we've never analyzed our funding structures to understand this as part of what we do in educational finance.
Can I say one more thing?
Before.
So I have a more specific answer. In terms of value added, at the elementary level, we worry about collaboration. At the elementary level, by and large, teachers are going into a classroom and instructing a group of students for the entire day. And that's just not the way it works at the secondary level, as one example. And so at the secondary level, we might worry a little bit more than we would at the elementary level about the issue of collaboration and whether what we are measuring in the case of the math teacher is actually the fact that you've got a terrific biology teacher who's also helping kids with their math. So I think that we need to worry more about those kind of complements that might happen at the secondary level.
Dr. Alexander, I just had a quick follow-up. I wanted to know what you all are doing with that data that you collect from those 11th graders that take that test to let them know if they're ready for college math.
We let the students know, we let the schools know, and we let their parents know.
And so my question is...
At the end of their junior year, and the superintendents, if they're, and I know my superintendent, he actually forces them into classes their senior year that they wouldn't have taken. So the school district knows it as well. And how they've responded locally. Our school district superintendent added a bunch of classes in English readiness and math readiness. And basically, he says, I voluntarily mandate that they go into those classes. And they do take those classes.
And that was going to be my question. If you find that a majority of the 11th graders are doing poorly, are you looking at teacher effectiveness, and are you looking at the effectiveness of your standards?
Not there yet. We're just trying to plug the hole of getting our juniors college ready prior to that. You know, those will certainly are next step considerations. I know President Ortiz, if you know this program well. So I think right now we're trying to figure out how to get our students college ready before they leave high school, because we have a very, very high percentage of students that need remediation upon entry, in the 40% range.
Thank you.
Did you want to comment on that, Dr. Ortiz? Or?
I would just add that what happens also is that as you establish what the criterion is for admission into the university system, both the University of California and the California State University system, it develops a natural articulation of the curriculum. Once they know the expectations in the schools, then they adapt what the instruction that's taking place so that it does have an impact on what's happening in the schools. In addition, we each have coordinators of the program that work with the schools directly, and if there's opportunity for collaboration with the university with regard to providing staff development activities, just bringing people together to talk about the subject matter, which many teachers in the schools don't have that opportunity for, all of those kinds of things help in terms of creating a sense of these are the things that are expected, and we need to work together to make sure that they're accomplished.
I have a question for the panel in general. It seems like I want to talk a little about certification on the front end, and so a combination of feedback we've gotten from a number of you. One is Dan cited the commonly viewed research now that certification and master's degrees are not effective predictors right now of quality in the classroom, where that predicts student achievement growth nationwide, right? And the second was from Roekel's point that so much of this is about great teaching is about the ability to adapt and the ability to learn and grow on the job and the ability to do induction and ongoing support much better than we do it now. And even Dr. Alexander's work is realizing, and the most progressive universities are now realizing, so much of their work is actually about support after a teacher has hit the school district, not about what you do on the preparation in advance. So given that body of research and testimony today, shouldn't this commission be thinking about how we change what the entry expectations are for teaching and instead begin to focus much more on the induction support once they hit the classroom? And what would you advise us to think about on that front?
Absolutely, yes. Now, I'll add one other thing that I think is really important that goes through this whole discussion. We now have the capability of collecting data far better than we ever had before, and we're developing very comprehensive data systems. One of the pieces that is absolutely essential is building the ability to analyze that data. One of the easiest things to find in looking at data is correlation, because you just compare two sets and you can find whether it has a high or a low correlation. The more difficult analysis is there a cause and effect? With my high school students, the example I always use is I said, you know, if we did a study of every single person who was involved in a car accident over the last 10 years, do you believe that at least 90% probably had a cavity or a filling in their mouth? Well, the answer is yes. There's a very high correlation. But is there any way to assume that having a cavity or a filling caused the accident? And it's so important to determine that when you think of education, because if you make the assumption that because there's a high correlation, what we really need to do is to eliminate cavities, to stop deaths in car accidents, you will not be successful. In education, we have the same danger. If because there's a high correlation between two sets of information, and you assume there's a cause and effect, you will spend all of your time and energy on trying to change a certain factor, and it will have no impact whatsoever on the result you're trying to change. So as part of our ability, as our ability to collect data grows and build these incredibly complex and comprehensive data systems, we must be about training leaders in education for that analysis, to determine that cause and effect, to know where we need to push to change the results so that we focus our energies in the correct place. And that's where I believe, why I said absolutely yes. I believe that what you do in that induction phase, once they're working with students and building that professional development, I believe that has a cause and effect impact on what happens with student learning. And that's why I believe it's such an important place to fix it. And the last comment I'll say, I know that research shows that master's degrees don't make a difference. But I think it is a false assumption or false conclusion then to say master's degrees aren't important. The ones they're getting are not important. But I guarantee that the master's degree program that Finland makes every teacher go through is powerful and makes a difference. So let's not throw out the master's degree, let's change it and make it a master's degree that actually impacts the kinds of skills and knowledge that for educators that will impact student learning.
Other people want to comment on that?
So I don't think you were suggesting this, but it's I would definitely say it's not an either or. That we probably want to focus on what kind of preparatory characteristics make folks successful when they get into the classroom, but still focus on their effectiveness once they're in the classroom, because we just see again and again and again that even when people hold particular, let me take experience. I said this earlier. We know really definitively that teachers get better in their first couple of years, by and large. But as I said, within the set of teachers in their early career, there are lots of novice teachers that are still more effective than a third-year teacher. And so the question is, do we want to base policy solely on these input characteristics? And I would argue the answer is no, which doesn't say that we still don't want to try and figure out what is going to make all of our incoming teachers more effective. I think it was a good point on the master's degree. That the way that we carry out policy on master's degree is we treat all master's degrees as if they are the same. Doesn't matter where you get the degree, doesn't matter if it's focused on your subject area, doesn't matter the level. And so there are probably a lot of things that we could do within the current system to improve things. And there are reasons that we don't. There are political, cultural reasons that we don't do that. Teacher evaluations right now, every teacher gets evaluated. It need not be the case that 99% of teachers get an excellent, right? So we need to think about the structure of the system that leads to the kinds of policies kinds of outcomes we actually see too.
But to use Mr. Van Roekel's example, I mean, when you think about NCLB, the original, a tremendous amount of focus out of that statute was creating this national obsession with highly qualified and forcing billions and billions of dollars of expenditures on certification, which is, in your example, is we spent billions and billions of dollars paying people to remove cavities before they got driver's licenses with the expectation that that would improve their driving, and it hasn't. So now the question is, ought we to keep spending billions of dollars investing in removing cavities when that doesn't have a known impact on their driving records? And what we ought to do is say, what are the characteristics of good drivers that we want to recruit and bring in, and how do we support them to be the kind of drivers we want to keep, and then allow us to support, evaluate, non-renew based on that criteria, but that the current focus doesn't seem to be yielding the outcome we're after, right?
Can I just add one more comment? So I'm an economist, so it's not surprising that I think about the world in terms of incentives. And I think that we don't have incentives in the system that would lead to a more effective front end right now. And in some ways, focusing on what the ultimate objective, which is student achievement, however you want to measure it, that will help us to figure out on the front end what is it that's associated with having more effective teachers? Which master's degrees seem to work? What kinds of teacher preparation seem to work? And we don't have incentives right now that would lead us down that road.
So what about a set of incentives that, to Aqua's point, that empower principals to have real autonomy to select teachers based on their knowledge of how good of drivers they think they are, with real accountability that principals are responsible to support those teachers to become and improve their effectiveness? And if they don't, those principals are held responsible for that data and non-renewed themselves. What about that as an incentive system?
I mean, this is my opinion, again, not a research opinion, but I basically think it's a good tenet to say that if you're going to hold somebody accountable, you have got to give them the tools to be successful. And in regards to principals, I think that a lot of times they are constrained by the structures in the system from having all the tools that they need to really be successful.
If I could add one comment on incentives. Number one, Quality Counts report came out, and I think it was 14 states require training in teacher observation and evaluation in order to get a certificate to be a principal. If only 14 states require that, the idea that we ought to give them more power to decide who's good and bad doesn't sit well with me. The other thing about incentives, if anything from the last 10 years that we've learned about incentives, is you have to be very careful of the unintended consequences. What you decide to measure in order to give an incentive, if that drives behavior, you have to make sure that that behavior enhances where you're trying to go. With what happened in the whole banking and Wall Street industry, it's a perfect example where everyone who achieved through their incentives, achieved those high pay and incentives, brought down the system. Not because somebody wanted to do that. There was no nasty, evil, or mean intent. But they designed an incentive system that if you succeeded in getting the incentive, the institution as a whole came down. There was a bank in England, been there for 500 years, and one of their young men who was a trader figured out the way to maximize his income through their incentive system. He brought down a 500-year bank because he did all the things right to earn an incentive, but not to enhance the overall structure. When we think of education, the overall outcome we want is for students to succeed. We can't have a system to continue that says to 25 to 30% of our kids, you will not graduate from high school. 1.2 million a year. If you're African American, Hispanic, or poor, it's close to 50%. In 10 years, that's 12 million kids who don't have a high school diploma. What's their shot at the American dream? That system consistently, year after year after year, produces that result. So we have to be very careful that if we try and change that system or transform it through incentives, that it actually changes the system for those students and not enhance certain pieces without changing that overall system. And its intent and purpose is to provide an education for students to be successful in life through career, to perpetuate a democracy. So I think incentive systems are very dangerous unless the kind of research goes in that adequate protections are built in, that there aren't unintended consequences that will actually make us worse off than we began.
Please, go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
Certainly, you're absolutely right. And at the same time, we can't ignore the fact that even when there aren't explicit incentives in a system, there are implicit incentives operating. So we have to be aware of those too. But my question is that there seems to be general agreement among the panel that selection into the profession is important. It's an important gateway. Right across the board, I think everyone has mentioned it. There also seems to be agreement across the panel is that what we really have to be concerned about is then actual performance in the classroom. People would measure it in different ways, but everyone is concerned with actual performance in the classroom. There is another critical selection point in the system that we really haven't discussed yet, and that is tenure. And so putting these things together, what do you think about how our current tenure policies are operating, and can they be improved to affect the productivity of the system as a whole?
I think I said in my comments, the current system is terrible. We put someone in a classroom, and for 3 to 5 years, we ignore them. Somebody goes in for 20 minutes a year, and they just continue through the system. There is no one, parent, community member, teacher, educator, student, who wants someone in the classroom who shouldn't be there. And just because you want to be a teacher doesn't make it possible. There are some people who have the greatest desire to be an effective teacher, and they get in there and they realize this is not my profession. And there's nothing wrong with them. It's just not a match. And so, especially during those first 3 to 5 years, to have a really powerful evaluation professional development system that says you spend a lot of time with them, and they should, in those first years. Figure out what those things are, and can they be corrected? If they can't or won't, they shouldn't be there.
I don't want to interrupt. I just know we're butting against a deadline. Given all your experience and given your membership and all its experience, how many years does it take, do you think, to really get a good grasp of whether someone should really be in the classroom and get tenure for life?
I think any individual who's given that opportunity to have a real emphasis and analysis of their practice, of what they're doing, and opportunities to improve, in 3 to 5 years, they will know. No one has to tell them. They will know whether or not this is the profession for them, and it will be obvious. But if you don't do any of those things that somebody can just say, oh, it's you and not you, I don't believe that's possible.
So 3 to 5 years of close scrutiny. Now, DC now has 2, tenure after 2, isn't that right? Is that your...
As far as I know, I don't think that language is solidified yet.
The rest of the panel is tenure selection point. Is there something we can do to improve it the way it's been discussed already?
I'm a principal of a charter school, and we don't have tenure. Even my veteran teachers get observed, and we have different levels of observation and evaluation for our teachers. So for a beginning teacher, I'm looking for certain things. For my veteran teachers, I'm looking for certain things. So you have to continuously improve upon your skill no matter how many years you're in the classroom. And I don't think it's right to say that just because you've been teaching for a certain amount of time, you don't have to improve upon your craft, because remember that things change, children change, and so you have to change to make sure you're meeting the needs of the kids. So, and my veteran teachers, they don't feel threatened about their jobs or anything like that because they get in there and they perform. So we don't have tenure, and it's not even, it's never brought up in our school or in our organization within our CMO.
Tenure is an entirely different beast in higher education. That's a whole other commission discussion. But I will say where it indirectly, the current system really, and I want to go back to this point, we have done a really good job in energizing some very new graduates to get interested in education again. Very good graduates, the most diverse graduate classes that we've ever had from all backgrounds. And we find many of them are first-generation students, because disproportionately first-generation students go into education first. That's where they want to go first, and they go back to their communities, and we have 50,000 of them gone back into the urban schools. But when we convince them, whether we put some federal incentives in place with loan forgiveness, then we put them in place, we send them out there for 2, 3, 4 years. They bring a different set of skills today that the students can relate to, whether it's technology or just diversity. Whenever we have a budget crisis, they're the first to go. Their energy levels, their enthusiasm, and they're there because they want to be there, and they want to help every single child in that classroom succeed. They'll do anything you want them to do in terms of evaluation, instruction. They're not wedded to the old system, but they're the first to go, and they call me and they say, I got to go back to graduate school. What field should I go into? Because apparently I've just gotten a pink slip. So I'm afraid we're losing this current system, and tenure fits into the current system. We're losing a whole new group of students that we have enticed without a whole lot of financial incentives. We've enticed because they have great hearts, they want to be educators, and they want to have an impact in children's lives. and they're the first to go in virtually every one of our states.
I
Shane, you
think there
wanna
are a couple
respond to this?
missed opportunities on tenure. I think first is the lack of a direct connection between performance standards and tenure that obviously could serve as an important selection element. I think the second one is about what our understanding of what tenure means. I think to this point, when the overwhelming number of teachers are passed from that third to fourth year in Colorado and receive that tenured status, what that means is the due process rights that attach to tenure. I think there's an opportunity, if you can provide a more meaningful tenure standard, to also rethink what that decision means, whether that is a point at which you can think about rewarding excellent educators in a different way, in which you think about opportunities for career development and expanded opportunities both in the classroom and outside the classroom. I think there's a way to rethink what it means when you come to a critical evaluation point like that and determine that you have someone who's driving successful outcomes with kids. There are tremendous opportunities for teachers that would receive that benefit.
In that way, it's sort of like making partner at a law firm, huh? You're talking about a distinction in role that both is based on merit and accrues real different responsibilities and rewards that come with it.
And means something very meaningful to the teacher who receives it right now. I think that is also a real missed opportunity for our educators right now, is that that isn't a meaningful decision within their careers. And I think it's an opportunity to not discourage, but really encourage highly effective teachers.
To Dennis's point, it's what happens after you've gone through 3 years of that 20-minute checklist observation, right, where the principal came through and didn't give you much valuable feedback, unfortunately. This has been a wonderful panel, so thank you all so much. We want to have time for public comments, so we want to thank the panel first and dismiss them. So thank you for a wonderful conversation. Thank you. And we're going to have about 15 or 20 minutes for public comment, and would welcome thoughts or input from anybody here who would like to make statements to the commission. I'd add a couple of ground rules if it could. First, if you can, we'd like to stress that the statements be short and focused as much as possible, and that you focus on a couple of key points you want us to know. Probably not as helpful to focus on questions to the commission, because we won't have time to necessarily answer all the questions now, but it's a chance for us to really gather public input and comment from you. So we'd love to have that. And if you can just tell us your name and any organization that you're part of or that you represent, we'd love to have that too. So at this point, we will open it to public comment. There's a microphone down here, and anybody, if you wish to make comment, go ahead and come on down. I'm good at wait time. I'm a teacher. We have a question from the panel. Dr. Ortiz is wondering how many folks in the room are teachers or have been teachers at some point. Great. I've been in so many conversations with teachers about NCLB. I've never seen a room of this many teachers with nothing to say about NCLB. I'm going to assume that means that the quality of the instruction that came from the panel was so outstanding that everybody knows everything they ever wanted to know about NCLB. And I think I will just take a couple minutes and wrap up, and then we'll let everybody go. A couple of announcements, and then I'll just do a quick wrap up of some of the things that we heard today. It is important to know that this is one stage of a series of hearings that the NCLB Commission is holding nationwide, and there are different focus areas. This subcommittee is obviously focused on teacher and principal effectiveness. There are others that are focusing on turnaround schools and some of the other significant challenges that are going on. And those hearings will be continuing at events around the country, all focused on this reauthorization of ESEA and how we provide the best and most thoughtful feedback on that. We also, for those who weren't quite ready to speak today but want to have input, there are going to be ongoing opportunities for public input that we will continue to make available going forward. That's through our website, which is nclbcommission.org. So I would encourage you to think about it, sleep on it, send us an email or send it to friends and have them put in input. Really is a great opportunity for us to leverage feedback to get to the folks on the Hill that are thinking about what to do. So in closing, just honored to be a part of this commission. The commission is co-chaired by Governor Roy Barnes from Georgia and Secretary Tommy Thompson from Wisconsin. And so it is meant to be and has been a truly bipartisan effort to rethink what has been the most significant piece of education legislation in the last generation, and a chance to try and improve that. I think what we heard today that was really compelling were things that some of us knew before, but it's some new twists on them. One is that we know unequivocally now that the effectiveness of a teacher is the single most important criteria in how well our students do. We heard from a number of folks that single outcome, how well students are performing and how well they're ready for college and careers, is the single most important outcome that we're responsible to. And what we want to try and find a way to do is to see how we can expand the number of teachers that have the ability to dramatically impact that. There's some studies right now that would indicate that if you take some of our most highly effective teachers, so say top quartile of most effective teachers, and put them in the classrooms with our students who are the farthest behind, you can actually close the entire achievement gap in about 3 years. So when you talk about all of the efforts right now to do that, our single best chance is around effective teaching. We know that effective teaching is somewhere around 2.5 times the effect size of classroom size reductions. So when we think about a lot of the educational reforms we've debated over the years, we know that effective teaching and effective school leadership are here to stay. We also know, as any of the teachers in this room could attest, that I love this quote by Reed Hastings, who was on the California State Board of Ed, who says, there are not a shortage of high-quality teachers. There are a shortage of high-quality work environments where teachers want to teach. And we know that that is by and large driven by principals, that where we have great principals, they attract great teachers and they grow good teachers to become great teachers. And where we don't have great principals, good teachers leave the school or leave the profession. And so ultimately we have a really powerful chance by focusing on effective teaching and effective leadership to transform the landscape. It's an interesting fact I learned last week that when you think about the state of Colorado and the leverage that school principals have on outcomes, in Colorado right now there are 3 times more certified medical doctors than there are school principals. 3 times more. And there are 6 times more certified attorneys in the state of Colorado than there are school principals. So when you think about the quality and the size of that pool and the ability of that pool to really drive dramatic reform and to support and grow and attract the best and the brightest teachers, it is a quite small group of people that we have the chance to make an enormous impact. And so if we all got to work for people like Danica or Aqua, I think that we would have a lot more teachers out in the world. So, and then finally, I think Dr. Alexander really made some compelling points about the power of transparency, which is we know now that good practitioners at every level are doing what your university is doing, which is saying the more data we can get about how our people are performing, whether they're principals, whether they're teachers, whether they're students, and the more we as professionals can dig into that data and say, what are we learning from it, and how can we improve our practices, improve our training programs, improve our induction and support programs based on that data, provides us a real chance to lead the kind of learning we want to see. And I think the same work that teachers are doing with their own students on looking at student achievement, or the work we want to do as policymakers and on school leaders on how we're finding out how effective our teachers are and how we can really use that data to capture knowledge about what good practice looks like, and then to be able to scale that knowledge by supporting more teachers to get better. So the beginning of a wonderful conversation today. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you, my fellow commissioners, for being here, and enjoy the snow.